Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just wanted to do this short video so you would get a little bit of the content that we were going to talk about today and just kind of follow up with some of the information that's in the upcoming benchmark and also some information that we started to address yesterday with the Mexica. If you remember, we were looking at the Mexica, and especially before pre-contact, this is, a large empire that's largely ruled through the Mexica as the top, political group. But of course, there's many different cultures and many different societies that are part of this empire, and many that are arguably very oppressed by the Mexica. And we'll talk just a little bit about the Spanish conquest today. We'll lay out some of the groundwork for that. Just a note, because I mentioned it in class, I'm not so sure if everybody got it. On Friday of this week, there's a benchmark that's due. Feel free to take extra days to hand that in. You do have a break coming up, and you might prefer to hand in the benchmark by Wednesday at 11:59. That's fine. I'll try to remember to change that on Schoology for you, but just, kind of keep that loose deadline in mind. That is fine with me. And this is content, though, that you'll want to be familiar with for the quiz, which will be next Friday. And a couple of things. The battle for Tenochtitlan, and this has a little bit of a timeline, and then what we'll do in this video is just showcase some pictographs from the Aztec or Mexica perspective that just gives you a sense of their particular narrative about Spanish conquest. Some of the key takeaways, and I'm just going to go through the various bullets that are on this slide. First, note that by 1521, Hernan Cortez, who is a Spanish conquistador, he's really operating on his own. He comes from Cuba. He had been part of Columbus's, task to have Spanish conquest over Cuba in 1517. And from Cuba, he makes his way to Mexico, but he does this without permission from the Spanish government. He actually asks for permission from the Spanish governor in Cuba, and he's denied, but he is essentially going to be insubordinate and will take a group of men and soldiers, sailors, and travel to Mexico in search of gold, largely. And so he becomes a conquistador who's kind of acting, on his own. He leaves in 1519, but by 1521, his army, which has been reinforced by others from Cuba, will largely, and also reinforced by indigenous populations that want to bring down the Mexica, he will be successful in conquering Tenochtitlan, which at the time in 1521, he will besiege and surround with boats for about 93 days. And the city ultimately will fall to the Spanish. And the Spanish will loot and burn a large part of Tenochtitlan. Prior to 1521, starting in 1519, Cortez lands with about 500, maybe a few more soldiers and sailors, and he begins a trek toward Tenochtitlan. And he knows where this city is, and it is his mission to travel to this city. He does ally with some local tribes along the way, some of which he also fights with. So there are actually conflicts and casualties as the Spanish and indigenous populations fight, but he will also meet members of the Tlaxcala, which, if you recall, is a group that is antagonistic toward the Mexica, and they do become allies, and the Tlaxcala will largely support the Spanish mission. Cortez is at one point given a gift of a young woman who had already been enslaved and had been sold into slavery. She spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl, and so when she comes to be with the Spanish, she serves largely as a translator. She's sometimes described in the text as La Malinche, but she serves a very significant purpose because upon the first meeting of Cortez and Montezuma II, she will be the translator, and let it be so that they will largely understand each other, at least through translation. In the longer term, La Malinche will actually have a son with Cortez, and there's a lot of questions about that relationship and, to what extent she was enslaved to Cortez. In any case, when Cortez arrives in Tenochtitlan for the very first time, he is arranged to meet with Montezuma II, and it is a very formal meeting. There's a lot of documentation of this meeting, and sometimes sources in textbooks describe that Cortez was believed to have been a god, that Montezuma thought that Cortez was a god, and as a result, kind of was very submissive toward Cortez. That theory has really been, beaten back by historians as something that's largely not true, and we'll look at some sources to depict why that's the case. But Montezuma II is likely being very strategic. He had a choice. He could bring his people immediately into war, which would have certain consequences. He had spies, so Montezuma had been trekking, and investigating what the Spanish advantages were, and it is likely that he was, aware of some of the Spanish weaponry, including guns and including armor and whatnot. At the same time, Montezuma's warriors would be very experienced at war. They had trained for war. They are largely, groomed for war. So it would not likely be the case that the Mexica would be afraid of the Spanish. So historians kind of refute the idea of Montezuma II being submissive. Largely, he's most likely being strategic in that he is awaiting out to see the Spanish next move before deciding war. And he has some advantage with the Spanish in his home turf. He is going to give them places to stay and basically watch them while they are in Tenochtitlan. Cortez does hear about the governor from Cuba coming, the Spanish governor from Cuba coming to Mexico with about 800 men to find him and to arrest him. And so he goes to deal with this conflict closer to the coast. And at the time Cortez leaves, the Spanish will attack the Mexica, who are practicing at the moment they're attacked a religious ceremony in honor of their patron god of Tenochtitlan, Huitzilopochtli. And so this particular event creates a great deal of ill will between the Spanish and the Mexica. The Mexica are largely, attacked during this religious ceremony, and it seems to turn them, exactly. They become more knowledgeable about what the Spanish goals may be, and they're going to really launch a counterattack. Cortez does put Montezuma II under house arrest, and Montezuma II's house arrest takes place for some time, and the warriors in Mexica do not really go against this house arrest. So there's some unknown exactly why that's the case, and Montezuma's brother will become the new leader. There is some question about this part of the story from the sources. There is some conflict. Montezuma is actually going to be killed at some point in the near future, and it really is not clear if he is killed by the Spanish or if he's killed by his own people who become distressed about the situation and take it out on their leader. It's largely believed that the Spanish create the situation, but it is not really clear. In the meantime, Montezuma's brother will launch a counterattack on the Spanish and the Tlaxcala, who are really with the Spanish, and this is known as La Triste Noche. The Spanish are beaten out of Tenochtitlan, and quite a few Spanish and Tlaxcala will die. And so it's a very significant event. And for about 5 months, the Spanish will go outside of the city and essentially plan for the last and final attack, which takes place in 1521. In that time period, there becomes a wide-scale smallpox, largely be believed to be smallpox. There's some debate about that as well, but a good amount of the Mexica population living in Tenochtitlan succumbs to this disease, and it makes a great deal of difference when there is the siege for 93 days in 1521. Something that historians have tried to do is look at the entire story from the Aztec perspective. And this is interesting because the Mexica largely have a pictorial type of representation. And this is something that we might see in the Mexica sources. For example, This is a description of Tenochtitlan. We can see it kind of over here on the left part of the map. And then we can kind of see the Spanish, arriving near the city of Veracruz, and ultimately that they are going to be, walking through, and kind of some of the things, that happen on the way, right? So this is from the Mexica perspective. There's also quite a few sources that are known as codices or a codex. A codex is a piece of information that has a lot of visual as well as textual descriptions. And in the case of the Mexica, the most significant codex is known as the Florentine Codex. And it's created in the time period of the 1500s, the late 1500s. It is created about maybe 1570 or so. So the conquest is in the 12th book in the Codex, and it is written in both Spanish and Nahuatl, and the writing is done by indigenous authors, most of whom would be Mexica, some of whom might be Tlaxcala, so they were on different sides, but the indigenous authors largely write under the direction of Spanish churchmen or Spanish missionaries. So there's a lot of questions about the way in which things are said and stated. There's also been a lot of studies in how different the text is that's translated into Spanish and what it is stated in Nahuatl, and then what seems to be clear by the drawings, because it could very well be that, in the translation of the text, for example, into Spanish, there might have been some differences in the way, for example, the Spanish are viewed, or the way that a particular person, like Montezuma II, is viewed. But some of these sources come from various codices, okay? This is a famous pictograph that depicts Montezuma II on the roof of his home palace, and we get a sense of some of the topography and the landscape. What's notable about this is it's the beginning of one of the codices, and it describes the falling of a comet, and something that's in some of the text is a description of basically a premonition of sorts that something horrible is going to happen. And if you remember, the Mexica believe that, the universe will ultimately be destroyed, and it will largely be destroyed by a certain specific factor. And Moctezuma is looking for signs from the gods that this is an up-and-coming event. Because this is taking place and being created after Spanish conquest, and it's at that time where there's a lot of information about the outcome of Spanish conquest, it's not likely that this really is representing a premonition that happens on the first day before Spanish conquest and somebody's remembering, oh, I probably had this premonition, or Montezuma had this premonition. Likely it is starting off a narrative that everybody knows the ending to. So in a sense, maybe almost like a kind of a beginning of the narrative that would be appropriate based on the outcome and the ending. So something to keep in mind is that the authors of the source would know the outcome of, the deaths to smallpox, the destruction of Tenochtitlan, and the outcome, of the Spanish conquest. So it's hard to look at this just only as a primary source. We have to kind of consider the purpose of the source in the nature of the way we might consider this. But it does also perhaps put into some historians' heads the idea that maybe Montezuma, who was incredibly religious, he was a priest, maybe he did have some beliefs that there was going to be an end of the world. And when he saw the Spanish, maybe part of what's plaguing him is this sense that that is what they have brought, and maybe that does affect his behavior. So it's a question that's out there based on what this presents. This is another drawing from the Codex. This happens to be from the Florentine Codex. It was put together by a friar by the name of Bernardino de Sahagún. But the Spanish we can see on the left, and the Aztecs we can see on the right. And we see La Malinche in the middle, kind of representing, in a sense, this meeting between Montezuma and Cortez. We can literally see her words, traveling back and forth between the two. And we can see the Spanish with their steel, spears. And that seems to be, represented. There's also a sense that there is a depiction of, there is a a variety of text about this meeting. So maybe we can bring in some of the sources here. There is some text in the handout that you had, and I'll also post it today so you can check it out. One is Cortez's account. This is a letter that Cortez wrote to Charles V. Charles V being the same Charles V